The coffee was $2.40, paid in cash. Coins counted onto the counter, one at a time. The way a man counts money when every dollar of it actually matters. Grady Ashwell pushed through the door and out onto the sidewalk, flannel gone soft and gray at the elbows, and that was when he heard the laugh. 3 women stood at the window, sunglasses pushed into styled hair, one of them pointing straight at him, the other 2 dissolving into laughter behind their hands. A billionaire single dad pretends to be poor to find true love. Then this happened. Grady's jaw tightened. He didn't slow down. He didn't look back. He walked past the laughter with the coffee warm against his palm, and something in his chest went very still, the way it always did when the world decided, without knowing one true thing about him, exactly what he was worth. The bell over the workshop door was still swinging when Poppy came flying out from behind a stack of reclaimed cedar boards, both arms wide, a rusted brass hinge held up like treasure in one small fist. "Dad, Dad, look what I found in the scrap bin." Grady set his coffee down on the workbench and crouched to her level, turning the hinge over with the same care he gave everything that crossed that bench, whether it was worth $4 or $400. "That's a good one," he said. "Off an old sea chest, I'd guess. Feel how thick the pin is. They don't make hardware like that anymore." Poppy nodded solemnly, already losing interest in the hinge itself and leaning instead into his side. And he let her stay there a moment, one hand resting on the back of her head, breathing in sawdust and the particular smell of an 8-year-old who had run the whole 4 blocks from school without once slowing down. Otto Meacham let himself in not long after, keys jingling on a ring worn smooth from years of use, a folder of rent receipts tucked under one arm. "You're a week early," Grady said, not looking up. "I'm a week early because I like watching you pretend to be surprised every single month." Otto set the folder on the corner of the workbench and looked around the shop, at the half-finished rocking chair, the sea chest waiting for new hinges, the smell of linseed oil hanging warm in the afternoon air. "Business good?" "Business is fine." It was the kind of exchange 2 men could have for years without either one asking what the other did before this life, and that suited Grady just fine. Otto had never once asked why a man his age started over with sandpaper and a rented storefront. Grady had never asked why Otto, who had clearly once worked somewhere with better lighting and better coffee, chose now to spend his days collecting rent checks along a street nobody with real money seemed to care about anymore. The door opened again, and this time it was someone new, someone who paused just inside the threshold the way people do when they aren't quite sure whether they've stepped into a business or somebody's living room. She had a city badge clipped to the lapel of her blazer and a folder considerably thicker than Otto's tucked under one arm. "I'm looking for the owner of Ashwell Restoration," she said. "Simone Kavanaugh. Charleston Small Business Renewal Program. That's me." Grady wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "Grady, you applied for the historic facade grant back in March." "I did." Her eyes moved past him, first to Poppy perched on a stool with the hinge forgotten in her lap, then to the sea chest, and finally to the seam along its lid where Grady had matched century-old joinery so precisely it barely showed at all. "Your application didn't mention that you also do contract restoration for the Historical Society. Didn't seem relevant to a facade grant. It's extremely relevant. It's the entire reason I'm authorized to fund a one-man carpentry shop instead of sending you back to reapply as a hobbyist." She almost smiled. "Almost. I'll need to walk through your last 12 months of invoices. Today, if you have the time." "I've got the time." Poppy piped up from the stool, holding out the hinge like an offering. Simone crouched without a second's hesitation, folder tucked under one arm, and studied the rusted brass with the same seriousness she'd give a spreadsheet. "I would love to see what you found." Grady watched the 2 of them a moment longer than he strictly needed to, this stranger with a city badge kneeling in his sawdust to admire a scrap of hardware like it actually mattered, and something in him, some old and careful instinct, quietly took note. She spent the better part of an hour with him going through invoices, and Grady found himself surprised at how carefully she read each one, not skimming for a signature, but actually reading the line items, asking why a set of hinges cost what it cost, Whether the Historical Society paid on net 30 or net 60, how many hours a full restoration typically ran against how many he'd actually billed. "You're underbilling," she said finally, tapping one invoice. "By a lot. The Historical Society doesn't have deep pockets. Neither do you, according to this application." She looked up at him, not unkindly. "Most contractors pad their hours. You're doing the opposite." Grady shrugged, a little uncomfortable under the attention. "I like the work. Didn't get into it to get rich. Nobody says that anymore." She said it lightly, almost a joke, and didn't notice the way his expression flickered for half a second before he covered it with a smile. Otto, still lingering by the door with his folder of receipts, cleared his throat. "He fixed my mother's hope chest for the cost of the hardware. Wouldn't take a dime for the labor." "That's not relevant to the grant file," Grady said. "It's relevant to something," Simone said, and made a note in the margin of her own folder that had nothing to do with facade grants at all. Outside, the afternoon light slanted gold through the front windows, catching all three of them together, and for a moment the shop looked like something it hadn't looked like in 3 years. Whole, 2 miles across town, on the 9th floor of a glass tower where the Ashwell Holdings name was still set into the lobby marble in brushed steel letters, Sterling Wexford stood at the head of a conference table and told a room full of investors that the historic block on Trad and Meeting would, as of next quarter, become a boutique hotel and a retail corridor built around it. "Current tenants hold month-to-month leases," he said, advancing the slide. "Termination notices go out within the week." Nobody in that room asked what had happened to the man whose name was still etched downstairs. That story had been settled 2 years earlier, in whispers and a single terse press release, a leadership dispute following a personal tragedy, a quiet departure, a board that had, with appropriate solemnity, simply moved on. Sterling had learned exactly how to let silence do the work a defense never could. His phone buzzed twice during the meeting. He ignored it both times. Across town, in a narrow office, 2 blocks from the workshop, Dot Feeney set down the same phone and dialed again, this time to a number saved under no name at all. "He's moving faster than we thought," she said, the moment Grady picked up. "Termination notices go out this week." The whole Trad and Meeting block. Grady stood very still in the back room of his own shop, a chisel forgotten in one hand. "That's Otto's building. It's a lot of people's building. It's also the block where your renewal officer just approved a facade grant this afternoon." He closed his eyes. "She doesn't know. None of them know. That's the arrangement you chose. You wanted to disappear. This is what disappearing costs." Because that was the truth, nobody watching him sand down a chair leg would ever have guessed. Grady Ashwell had never actually lost control of Ashwell Holdings. He still held the majority of it. Quietly, through paper that only 3 lawyers and Dot Feeney had ever seen. He hadn't been pushed out of anything. He had walked out, 18 months after his wife's funeral, the day he finally looked at his own life and realized that every person in it wanted something from the name on the building, and not one of them had ever once asked what he wanted. So he had let the story about the boardroom dispute stand, unchallenged, because a story people already believed rarely needs defending. And in the quietest life he could build for himself and his daughter, he had gone looking for exactly one person who might like the version of him that owned nothing at all. He hung up with Dot and stood a long while in the workshop doorway, looking at Poppy's crayon drawings taped crooked along the wall, the hinge she'd found still sitting on the bench beside his tools. For the first time, the truth stood plainly in front of him, with nowhere left to hide. He was not a fallen man playing at poverty by accident. He had built this disappearance on purpose, brick by brick, the same way he'd once built a company, and the cost of it was about to come due on a street he loved. That night he sat on the edge of Poppy's bed long after she'd fallen asleep, the rusted hinge still clutched in one small hand, and he said, quietly enough not to disturb the air, "Nobody is taking this from us. Not this street, not any of it." He meant the shop. He meant more than the shop, though he wasn't ready yet to say what, even to himself. Across town, Simone sat at her desk long after the office had emptied, staring at a planning department notice that had just landed with the weight of a dropped stone, change of ownership status, entire Trad and Meeting corridor, Effective next quarter, no protections extending past 30 days. She scrolled down. Ashwell Restoration was listed by address and tenant, alongside 13 other small businesses she'd spent 6 months fighting to fund. She thought of the girl on the stool holding up a scrap of brass like a jewel, and the man who'd looked faintly embarrassed by how carefully she'd examined his joinery. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. Somebody's name sat behind this decision, buried 3 shell companies deep, and she intended to find out exactly whose before she let an entire block of her own program get bulldozed for a hotel lobby. She came back to the shop 2 days later, no folder this time, just herself, and found Grady bent over an old chest of drawers, with the top panel removed, running his fingers along a warped seam with the kind of attention most people reserved for something breathing. "That's not on your invoice list," she said from the doorway. "It's not for a client." He didn't look up right away. "It was my wife's. Water got into it during a storm last year. I keep meaning to finish repairing it, and I keep finding reasons not to." Simone stood there a moment, unsure whether she'd walked into something too private to witness, and then sat down on the stool anyway, the careful way you sit down next to someone else's grief when it hasn't asked you to leave. "How long ago?" she asked. 3 years. He set the panel down gently. "Poppy says she remembers her mother's voice. I don't think she really does. I think she remembers being told what it sounded like. I'm sorry. Everybody's sorry. Doesn't fix the panel." He said it without bitterness. Just tired. And something about the honesty of it made Simone stay a while longer than she'd planned. She found herself telling him, without quite meaning to, about her own father, and the reason she'd taken this job instead of the law firm offer that would have paid her twice as much. A childhood spent watching a family hardware store get squeezed out by a chain 3 blocks over, while nobody at City Hall lifted a single finger. "I got tired of watching people lose the thing they built, because nobody official cared enough to notice," she said. "So I decided to become the person who notices." Poppy wandered in partway through, settled cross-legged on the floor with a pencil stub and a scrap of pine, and 20 minutes later presented Simone with a drawing. 3 stick figures under an enormous sun, the tallest one unmistakably meant to be her. "Is that supposed to be me?" "You're the one holding the folder," Poppy said, as if that settled the matter entirely. Simone laughed, surprised into it, and pinned the drawing to the corkboard herself without asking anyone's permission, right beside Poppy's other work, and nobody in the room seemed to mind. Neither adult mentioned what the other actually did before this life. She knew him as the carpenter with historical society contracts and a quiet, careful daughter. He knew her as the woman with the city badge, who had taken her time deciding whether his little shop was even worth saving. Neither of them had thought yet to ask for more than that, because there had never once been a reason to. When she finally rose to leave, he walked her to the door, and they stood there a beat too long, neither saying the obvious thing, the street light outside just beginning to hum on for the evening. "I'll be back Thursday," she said, "about the notices." "I know," he said. "I'll be here." She left. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk farther down the block than he strictly needed to. By the end of that week, the termination notices had gone out to every tenant on the block, autos included, printed on Ashwell Holdings letterhead, with Sterling Wexford's signature stamped across the bottom and 30 days circled in red at the top. Simone spent 4 days fighting a battle inside City Hall that nobody above her particularly wanted fought. Her director told her, not unkindly, that going after a company the size of Ashwell Holdings over one commercial block was not a fight the renewal program was built to win. "Pick your battles, Simone. This is the battle. It's 14 small businesses and a street that's been here since before this building was. It's one developer with better lawyers than either of us. Then I'll need better paperwork instead." She pulled the appeal draft across the desk toward her and started marking it up right there, standing. Coat still on. "I want tenant impact statements from every business on that block. I want photographs. I want the Historical Society's letter about the facade grant attached as an exhibit. If Ashwell Holdings wants to fight this in front of a review board, they can fight it against 14 real people instead of a form letter." Her director sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had learned it was easier to let Simone win small fights than to keep losing the argument about whether she should be having them. "You have until Friday." "I have until Friday," she agreed. Already halfway out the door, with 3 folders under one arm, she kept fighting anyway, filing the appeal for a 90-day extension, gathering tenant signatures block by block, standing on Otto's doorstep and the tailor's next door and the little bakery on the corner, asking each of them to put their name to a page that might not matter at all against a company with Ashwell Holdings resources, and getting every signature anyway, staying 2 nights running with her office, the only lit window in the whole building at 9 o'clock. Grady, meanwhile, did his own quiet fighting 3 streets over, sitting across from Dot Feeney going through paperwork that would, when the time finally came, prove exactly who still controlled the majority of Ashwell Holdings stock. "You could end this in an afternoon," Dot said. "1 phone call, 1 meeting with the board, and then everyone knows. Everyone already suspects something. You cannot run a shop this quiet forever, Grady." He didn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer that didn't lead directly to Simone, to the hinge and the drawing pinned, crooked on the corkboard, and the way all of this had started to feel like something worth protecting for reasons that had stopped being about buildings weeks ago. That evening, back at the shop, he sat Poppy down at the workbench with a scrap of walnut no bigger than her 2 hands, and showed her how to sand the edges smooth, how to fit a tiny brass clasp, salvaged from an old jewelry box. "Who's it for?" Poppy asked, working the sandpaper in slow, careful circles the way he'd shown her. "Miss Kavanaugh." "For helping us. Because she likes my drawings? Because of a lot of things." They finished the little box together 2 nights later, and when Simone came by to drop off the extension appeal paperwork, Poppy presented it to her with both hands outstretched. A small wooden box with a brass clasp, empty inside, because the box itself was meant to be the gift. Simone turned it over once, twice, running her thumb along a seam she now recognized as the same care he'd given the water-damaged chest. "You made this." "We made it," Grady said, nodding toward Poppy. She held it a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite words yet, gratitude tangled with a small, persistent unease she couldn't name, the sense that this careful, quiet man in front of her didn't fully add up, the way an antique sometimes feels heavier in the hand than its size should allow. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and drove home with the box resting on the passenger seat the entire way, glancing at it at every red light. The unease found its shape a few days later, when Simone arrived early for a walkthrough and heard Grady's voice through the half-open back door of the shop, on the phone, and it was not the voice she knew. "No. Absolutely not. That language is unacceptable. Tell counsel to redraft it before end of day." A pause, sharper than anything she'd heard from him before. "I don't care what Wexford's people are telling the board. I want the original filing on my desk by tomorrow morning." She stood frozen on the sidewalk, hand halfway to the door, until her shoes scraped the step, and the voice dropped instantly back into the register she knew, warm, a little tired, entirely ordinary, and by the time he pulled the door open he was just Grady again, sawdust on his forearms, asking if she wanted coffee. She told herself she'd misheard. She told herself plenty of men had a sharper voice on the phone than they did with their daughter in earshot. She told herself several things, working through the invoice binder with him that whole afternoon, and none of them entirely stuck. Otto came by that evening, visibly rattled, the termination notice folded and refolded in his coat pocket until the creases had gone soft with handling. 30 days, Grady. 30 days, and I've got nowhere zoned for the shop. "It's not happening," Grady said, and there was a certainty in it Otto, if he'd been listening less anxiously, might have found strange coming from a man who supposedly had no more standing in this fight than anyone else on the block. But Otto was too worried to notice, and Grady offered nothing further than the reassurance itself. "You keep saying that like you know something," Otto said, dropping into the one chair that wasn't covered in sawdust. "Do you know something? I know the appeal Simone filed is solid. I know a lot of people signed it. It was true, as far as it went," and Grady let the true part carry the whole sentence. Otto rubbed a hand over his face. 11 years I gave that company. Facilities, then leasing, then this. He gestured vaguely at the folder of rent receipts on the bench. You'd think 11 years buys you a phone call from somebody, at least. Instead, I find out my own block is getting sold from under me from a notice taped to the door. That's not right, Grady said, quiet, and meant it in a way Otto couldn't have understood the weight of. That night, the three of them, Grady, Poppy, and Simone, who had stayed later than she'd planned, ate dinner around the workbench out of paper containers, Poppy narrating an elaborate ongoing saga about her classroom hamster, while the adults traded quiet, easy looks across the sawdust between them. It was, Simone thought later, driving home with the little wooden box on the passenger seat again, the most like a family the three of them had looked yet, and that thought frightened her more than the sharp voice on the phone had. She sat outside her own house a long moment before going in, turning the box over in her hands, asking it, or asking herself, exactly who this man really was. 2 weeks later, alone in his office after hours, Sterling Wexford signed a supplemental authorization granting himself expanded transaction power over the trad and meeting sale, built from a signature template his assistant had drawn out of board minutes 8 years old. He did not notice, or did not care, that the authorization referenced a shareholder vote that had never technically occurred in the form the document claimed. He filed it. He moved on. Nobody watching would have known the difference, and for the moment, nobody was watching. Otto Meacham had worked for Ashwell Holdings for 11 years before the workshop, back when the company still had a facilities division, and Otto still carried a badge that opened doors on floors he no longer had reason to think about. When the appeal came back denied, and the 30 days ticked down to 12, he did the only thing that occurred to a man who had spent a decade in corporate filing rooms. He went looking for paper. He found a banker's box in his own garage, kept out of habit more than sentiment, full of old lease agreements from his facilities, years, and near the bottom, water-stained but legible, an original ground lease for the trad and meeting block, dated years earlier, bearing a signature Otto recognized instantly, because he had processed 100 documents with that exact handwriting back when it belonged to the man the company called, quietly, and with a certain reverence, the founder, Grady Ashwell, not a former employee, not a man pushed out. The signature on this original lease predated the so-called boardroom dispute by years, and it granted binding, specific protections to long-term tenants that Sterling's new authorization had never once acknowledged existed. Otto did not go to Grady with it. He didn't yet know there was any reason to. He went instead to the one city official who had been fighting for this block harder than anyone else, and he laid the water-stained lease across Simone's desk with hands that weren't entirely steady. I don't understand all of it, he admitted, but that signature is Grady Ashwell, the Grady Ashwell, founder of the whole company. I worked there 11 years. I'd know that handwriting blind. Simone stared at the name a long moment, and then at Otto, and then, slowly, sickeningly, at the memory of a voice through a half-open door saying tell counsel to redraft it before end of day. Otto. Her own voice came out unsteady. Where does this Grady Ashwell live now? Otto blinked. Nobody knows. He disappeared after his wife passed. Some kind of falling out with the board. He frowned at her expression. Why? She didn't answer. She was already reaching for her keys. She drove to the shop faster than the speed limit strictly allowed, and found Grady exactly where she always found him, bent over the workbench, sawdust on his forearms, and this time she didn't wait for coffee or small talk. She laid the water-stained lease down in front of him. Otto found this in his garage, she said. Tell me it isn't your signature. Grady looked down at the page. He didn't need to read it. He'd have known that document anywhere. He was silent for a long time. Long enough that the silence itself became the answer. Long enough that Simone felt something in her chest go cold and still, the exact way it had felt watching, weeks ago, on a stranger's phone screen, that video of 3 women laughing at a man on a street corner, before she had even known his name, a man absorbing something ugly without flinching, without explaining, simply absorbing it. Except this time she was the one standing outside a joke she had never been let in on. It's my signature, Grady finally said. Simone didn't move. Say the rest. So he did. All of it. In the flat. careful voice of a man who had rehearsed this confession in his head 100 times and never once planned to give it out loud. He told her about the wife he had lost, and the boardroom he had walked away from voluntarily, about the story he had let stand because a story people already believed needed no defending, about the majority stake he still held quietly, through paper only Feeney and 3 lawyers had ever seen. "I didn't lose control of anything," he said. "I walked away from being known for it. There's a difference. I know it doesn't feel like one to you right now. You let me think you were fighting the same fight I was fighting." Her voice stayed low, controlled, which somehow made it worse. "You let Otto think it. You let this whole street believe it. I didn't set out to fool anyone. I set out to disappear. Those aren't different things, Grady, not to the people standing next to you while you do it." She pressed her palms flat against the workbench, steadying herself. "I stood in a meeting with my own director, defending 14 small businesses against a company you could have shut down with one phone call, and the entire time, you were sitting 3 feet away letting me lose sleep over it. I wasn't going to let any of you lose the block. I told you that. You told me it wasn't happening. You didn't tell me why you were so sure." She laughed, short and humorless. "I thought you just believed in me. Turns out you just already knew the ending. I didn't lie to hurt anyone. You didn't have to mean it for it to hurt." She picked up the little wooden box from the shelf where she'd left it weeks earlier, turned it over once, and set it back down, gently, which was somehow worse than if she'd thrown it across the room. "I need to think." Poppy's voice drifted in from the back, asking if dinner was almost ready, and Grady's whole body went rigid at the thought of any of this reaching her. "Not in front of her," he said quietly, and Simone, despite everything, respected that enough to step outside onto the sidewalk, where the argument couldn't touch a child still drawing at the workbench. Feeney arrived less than 10 minutes later, summoned by one frantic text, and found Simone standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, staring at nothing at all. "He kept every promise he made to this street," said without preamble. 6 months of quiet legal work protecting exactly the tenants you've been fighting for. He never once let the company touch a single lease on this block, while he still had breath to stop it. I know that doesn't undo what he didn't tell you. But it's true, and you should have it before you decide anything." Simone looked at her a long moment, said nothing, and got in her car. She drove away without another word to Grady, who stood alone in his workshop doorway watching her taillights disappear around the corner, Poppy's voice still calling faintly from inside, asking again about dinner. Grady spent one sleepless night deciding, and by morning he had made a choice he'd been avoiding for 2 years. He called an emergency session of the Ashwell Holdings Board, the first meeting he had personally requested since the day he'd walked out. He brought the water-stained original lease. He brought Feeney and 3 lawyers and a folder documenting 6 months of quiet legal work done from a workshop nobody had thought worth investigating. Sterling Wexford was still adjusting his cufflinks when Grady walked into the boardroom, and the color left his face by degrees, first at the sight of Grady at all, then at the folder in his hands. "This is highly irregular," Sterling started. "So is forging a shareholder authorization off an 8-year-old board minute," Grady said, and laid the documents on the table for every director present to see. The original lease, dated and signed, its tenant protections plainly, legally binding, beside the supplemental authorization Sterling had filed weeks earlier. Its referenced vote traceable, on record, to a meeting that had never taken place in the form the paperwork claimed. The room went very quiet. "I am the majority shareholder of this company," Grady said, steady, unhurried, in the voice Simone had once overheard through a half-open door. "I have been since the day my wife died, and every one of you decided that meant I'd stepped away from it. I let you believe that because it was easier than fighting for a version of my life that had nothing to do with this building. I'm done letting it be easier." Sterling's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. "The board can't simply take his word over a filed authorization." "The board isn't taking my word," Grady said. "It's taking a dated, notarized lease over a signature template built from minutes that don't say what your authorization claims they say. That's not my word. That's the record." One of the older directors, A woman who had sat on the board since before Grady's wife had died, leaned forward and studied both documents side by side for a long, silent minute before she finally spoke. "I'd like to hear from counsel before we vote, but I want it on record that I never once liked how quietly this transition happened 2 years ago. Nobody explained it to my satisfaction then either." The vote, when it came, was 7-1, and Sterling Wexford's resignation was accepted by the board before lunch. Simone had come at Dot's quiet, urgent invitation, standing near the back of the room through the entire confrontation. And when it ended, when the room began emptying out around them, her eyes found Grady's across the space between them, and neither of them said a word. But something in the distance between them had already changed its shape. 3 weeks later, the local paper ran a small story beneath a photograph of the trad and meeting block. "Historic corridor secured for long-term tenants. Preservation Trust finalizes agreement." Otto's name appeared in the second paragraph, quoted and grinning. Grady's name did not appear at all, which was, Simone suspected, exactly how he'd arranged it. She read the article twice at her desk and did not call him. 2 weeks after that, she found herself outside the shop on a quiet afternoon anyway, telling herself it was purely professional, a final check on the grant paperwork now that the crisis had passed. Poppy was inside alone, cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book, and looked up with the open delight of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide how glad she is to see someone. "You came back." "I came back," Simone said, and meant more by it than the folder in her bag. Grady came out from the back room, wiping his hands on the same rag he always used, and stopped short at the sight of her standing there. They talked a long while, longer than any grant review had ever required, out on the front step in the fading light, while Poppy colored just inside the doorway. Simone told him she understood. In the part of her that had grown up watching a family store get crushed by people who never had to explain themselves, exactly why a man might want to disappear and be loved without his name attached to it. "I still needed you to tell me," she said. "Not let me find it in a water-stained box in somebody's garage." "I know," Grady said. "I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking for the chance not to do it again. What does that actually look like, practically?" She wasn't asking to be difficult. She genuinely wanted an answer. "It looks like I tell you things before Otto finds them in a garage," he said. "It looks like, if the company ever needs me again, you hear about it from me at dinner, not from a headline. I'm not going back to running it day to day. I still don't want that life. I just don't want to hide the rest of it from you either." "And Poppy?" "Poppy knows her dad owns a workshop and used to work somewhere before her mom died." "That's true. When she's older, she'll know the rest of it. I'm not going to lie to her either. Not even by omission. Not once she's old enough to ask the right questions." Simone studied him for a long moment, weighing that against everything else she now knew about him, and something in her settled, not all the way, but enough. She was quiet a long moment, looking at him the way she had that very first day, careful, appraising, and then something in her expression eased. "Dinner," she said, "the three of you. Tonight." Poppy, overhearing exactly the part she wanted to hear, came flying out onto the step and wrapped both arms around Simone's waist before anyone could stop her, and Simone laughed, surprised again, and let her stay there. They sat together on the front step a while after that, not saying much, Poppy's coloring book abandoned between them, the evening settling gold and slow over the old brick street, closer to each other than they had allowed themselves to be in weeks. Months later, the trad and meeting block looked almost exactly as it always had, except for the small brass plaque near Otto's building, reading Historic Tenant Corridor, established in perpetuity, and the fact that every shop on the row was still open, still owned by the people who had built them there. Grady's workshop hadn't changed either, except that now it was a choice instead of a disguise, and he found he liked the work exactly as much as he had when he thought it was all he had left in the world. On a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the three of them walked the length of the block together, Poppy skipping ahead over the seams in the sidewalk, counting them under her breath, 1, 2, 3, the way she counted everything now. They passed the coffee shop on the corner, without either of them planning it, the same window, the same door, and for a moment Grady's steps slowed, some old instinct bracing for a laugh that never came, because there was no one there this time who needed to point at him, and even if there had been, it would not have mattered, not with Simone's hand finding his, without either of them making a decision about it. Poppy ran back and took hold of both of them at once, one hand in each of hers, and the three of them walked on together past the very window where all of it had started. He hadn't needed to pretend to be poor to find out who truly loved him. He had only needed to stop moving long enough for someone to catch up, and she had.